Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam, brother. How are you?
I'm good. We're live. We were gonna just speak before going live, but we were getting a bit late. How are you doing?
Alhamdulillah, yourself?
Very good. You're are you using a phone or your PC? It's very good audio, very good video as well.
I'm just using my computer.
Nice. So how have you been? How has the lockdown treated you?
It's upon us a real experience, like to experience a pandemic when the last one of any kind of serious severity, I suppose, to merit such a response was about, 101 years ago, I believe.
Yeah.
No, sorry, 1998, So yeah, it'd be 101 years ago.
Wow. Yeah. And that was, I mean, because of mass communication and mass, just the way we are humans, people know about it. I mean, in the past, you wouldn't know about it till someone died. You'd be like, oh my God, there's a plague going on. So just to make a quick introduction to Abdullah Andalusi, he's a leading Muslim public intellectual, involved in many debates, even debates at the Oxford Union, Cambridge University, many prestigious Western universities. He is from Muslim Debate Initiative, and he debates on the topic of God, politics, religion. Even, I was very happy to see, what's the name of that defense? Chatham House? Is it Chatham House or something?
Oh, Chatham House, yes.
Chatham House, yes. Sorry?
The think tank, I believe.
Yeah, exactly. For anybody who doesn't know, that's like big. Yeah, that's like, when I saw that, I was like, whoa, because that is, if you like, the Sandhurst of thinking tanks. I guess you could call it that. So why I wanted to bring
I like how you kind of thought, like, for those people who didn't know about what Chatham House is, they would probably know what a military officer school would be in the UK.
The funny thing about Sandhurst is that a lot of Muslim leaders are actually graduates. So, a lot of people, they do know about it. So why I wanted to bring Abdullah on today is because, as you guys know, I've been pushing for all of us during this lockdown to convey the message of Islam online, and also to introduce you guys to the various scholars, du'at, activists, thinkers that we have across the Muslim world. And as part of that series, how can we not have Abdullah Andalusi? It's a no-brainer. So today, Abdullah, we're going to be discussing a talk that you gave in Toronto, in Canada, a few years ago. And the talk was called, Do We Really Need God? And I thought that was a perfect topic, considering the crisis we're in and the fact that even a lot of non-Muslims are asking these existential questions. So just to warm us up, tell us, why do you think this is an important topic?
Well, I mean, in the modern Western world, when they have essentially divorced religion from any considerations of ethics and their political systems, that people have started to believe that God is a private matter, which might be useful for yourself if you need that as a psychological crutch, but has no and should have no effect outside of the personal realm. So this is the current prevailing paradigm in the West. And of course, by kind of secondary transmission to the rest of the world after colonialism, which very much now looks up to the West for intellectual and moral leadership. And that's why it's become so pervasive, because religion, when I say religion as in a way of life connected to a power higher than human beings, is now no longer considered to be or should be part of people's kind of practical lives, the management of affairs in society and so on and so forth. So people then you see the rise of atheism, of course, because people say, well, you know what, maybe we don't need this crutch anymore, even on a private level. And that's kind of the natural progression after secularism would be atheism.
And I think that's a important link that people don't really notice. It's a bit subtle, but when you start making God a private matter, then automatically that has an impact, although it shouldn't, on your metaphysical view, because you start thinking, well, if it's irrelevant, maybe it's not even true.
Well, of course. I mean, just look at it. Let's say a child grows up in a society, and they're told that they have to do maybe once a week or a few times a week some ritual actions, or if you want something, make a wish, rub a lamp, so to speak, and that's what religion is. But then your day-to-day life, that the creator of the universe, your human purpose of life hereafter has no relation to your day-to-day life, to your getting of daily bread, to obviously getting what you need, your supplies, advancing yourself, social ranking, and all this stuff has no connection to the higher existential concepts. Then people will start to wonder, well, why do we even need it? And usually it's tolerated when it's kept private. But if ever people ever argue that, well, you know what, there's a creator to the universe and there's a purpose for human existence, then surely this should have a meaning for human life. They're viewed as, bothersome preachers or bothersome individuals who are trying to transgress the limits that were the containment that religion has been assigned. And I use the word religion in one way, but religion, generally speaking, at least to our ancestors, and I'm not just referring to the ancestors of the time of the caliphate for 1,300 years. I'm talking about throughout all civilizations, there was no distinction between religion, law, and way of life. The word in Arabic and the word obviously from the Quran, it just uses the term deen as a catch-all term, which I think is very expressive, because I think actually, if you think about it, if you look at the actual how people treated law and how people treated their culture, there was no distinction between culture, religion, and law. It was all one and the same thing. And in fact, when we use the word culture versus religion, we actually are inadvertently secularizing the concept. But I'll come on to that a bit later.
No, definitely. And that sort of reminds me of one thinker who was talking about ignoring the validity of Muslim culture, the need for that as a sort of background for Islam to thrive. Now, before we get into the actual topic, when you were a non-Muslim, you were explaining your journey to Islam, and one of the things you mentioned to me a few years ago was that one of the things that attracted you to Islam was the fact that it's an entire package, right? And that's obviously related to this topic. So why don't you just give us a few details about that?
Okay, so basically, it seems quite obvious when you think about it. And when I thought about it as a child growing up, I thought, look, I'm going to live my whole life. I'm going to be working. I'm going to be obviously with family. I'm going to be trying to advance myself in some way, shape, or form in this society, in this life. What's it for? Right. So for what purpose? What ultimately will be the ultimate purpose behind all of this? So before I engage on that journey, I need to know what I'm doing it for and what the whole point of everything generally. And so I went into an investigation to find out what is, the purpose of life of human beings, of existence, of creation, of everything in it, the universe, everything in itself, because they were always going to be linked. Right. And I'd never understood how people could in one way talk about a hereafter from nominal Christians, nominal secular Christians, and then live their lives like they had no relation to their worldly affairs. I said, surely if there is a creator, if there is a purpose behind our existence, it would be an underpin and affect every aspect of our life. We can't be part-time, have a part-time purpose, right, or part-time meaning to our lives. So it was just natural. And so when I encountered Islam, and some of it's also its political kind of guidance, as well as its ethical and other aspects of guidance, and it's also concept of tawheed and monotheism and so on. I thought, well, this is exactly what I'm expecting from a purpose of life, a guidance from a creator would be something that would be holistic, and it fitted the bill of what I was expecting. In science, you make a prediction, and then you see, if the results match the prediction, it lends good credence to the prediction, to the theoretical framework that have made that prediction, that can make that prediction. So my conclusion was that, well, certainly Islam looks and fits the bill of what I predicted would be guidance from the Creator. And of course, subject to more tests, so to speak, which was just testing for consistency, testing for whether it's consistent with reality. I found that it was the only possible explanation for human existence, and which is why I embraced Islam. And it's why everyone who converts to Islam embraces Islam for the most part. They'll just say intuitively, they'll just tell you it makes sense. Islam just makes sense. And what they're really telling you is that Islam, they came to the realization that Islam was the only possible explanation for existence.
Yeah, excellent way of putting it, because it is definitely something quite logical when you think about it. Because if religion is real, if God is real, if the hereafter is real, then obviously that has a direct impact on every aspect of our society. Now, I wanted to bring in an important issue that we're facing today. On this particular live stream, we do actually have some atheists who join us, so this is going to be perhaps quite more beneficial to them than to the Muslims, because the Muslims probably know this stuff. But when an atheist says we don't need God, right? And then when we face a crisis like today, with people worried about their livelihood, with European nations which are usually quite well integrated, actually almost, acting in a very selfish way, and people worried about just the future. And then even people of faith sometimes saying, why has God allowed this to happen? So from this angle, how would you address that problem?
Okay, so in kind of reverse order. So they call it the problem of evil, and the problem of evil is really just the problem of people making assumptions about what this life is for. So if this life was only for pleasure, and living up to 100, let's say 110, 120 years, if every human being was meant to live to 120 years, experience nothing but unremitting pleasure, then I would say, okay, there is contradictions here. But who said that our purpose is just to enjoy ourselves, to experience pleasure? That's an assumption, and that's the assumption that comes from you could say, the dean of liberalism, which, even though it's not classified as a religion in the modern sense, in the ancient world, it would be classified as a way of life. A deen, the Greek word would be politeia, which actually, I know it's connected to the word politics, but really it means the way of life of the people of a city, their way of life. Sometimes it's translated as constitution, but it means a way of life. So the liberal dean believes that the purpose of existence, or it has a few, obviously, creeds within it, but generally the creeds argue for the purpose of existence is pleasure, to seek pleasure, happiness through, to seek happiness, and so on. Now, the problem with this assumption is that, well, where's it grounded upon? Because surely pain is as well part of our existence as well as pleasure, right? And that doesn't make sense. And of course, if human beings were meant to, let's say, have pleasure, why don't they have no free will then, so that they can't harm each other, do bad things to each other, so that they could just live harmoniously without free will? You don't have to have free will to be happy, so to speak, right? Where's that argument come from? And it's also taken as an aspect of dogma almost, to believe that, well, free choice or freedom is happiness. It's like, well, who said that, right? I mean, that is clear. I mean, many social studies have shown that the more choice people are given, the more stress they encounter, because they are worried about opportunity costs and making mistakes and a whole number of things. So almost people like to have simple choices as well. So they like to have less choice than more choice, given in many scenarios. So it's an assumption. And so when the universe contradicts that assumption, instead of saying, well, maybe our theory about purpose of life is wrong, they say, no, oh, well, if I believe that God was underwriting this theory, therefore God doesn't exist. That's what they say. Whereas as Muslims, and obviously from the Islamic basis, we are told that the purpose of this life is to worship God in the limited duration that we have to do so. And to make that meaningful, to have a meaningful choice on the matter, you have to have kind of aversions and also seductions. So you have to have things that attract you, as in pleasure, and things that obviously avert you, which is pain. And these are part of of our existence, and it's required to give us the function of free will. So we have to choose between two things. One might be the best way of doing something, but it's harder, and one might be the easy way of doing something, but it's not correct, it's not right. So that's why. And as I said, everything in this existence is to worship God, even if and not every. And also, to a second point to add a caveat to that, is that not everything in this universe, although everything has exactly the same purpose to worship God, but not everything is meant to do it in the same way. So obviously, inanimate objects, their worship of God is their very existence, right? Their very existence is an ayat of Allah, proof of God's existence. Animate things that experience the world, which might not have free will, like, let's say, animals, their purpose is to worship God by both existing and experiencing the world and as witnesses. Now, us, we have all those purposes, and in addition, we have an extra thing, which is free will, to choose to voluntarily accept God and to choose to conceptualize God and to choose to act in accordance with that concept. And of course, as I said, and even within that, not every human being will be asked to worship God in the same way. Some people exist in God's foreknowledge to merely be tests for other people. So these people are, let's say, incorrigible reprobates, and they only exist to provide challenges for other people who are sincere. Other people are just here to be witnesses and also as a test in a different way. For example, a child might live only to 1 year old, for example, and then pass away, sadly. And that will be a test to their parents. How do they overcome this? How do they deal with the cause of this? How does society deal with the causes of that child's death? Was it maybe an earthquake and the buildings weren't built properly with that consideration? Will the government actually care about people's lives to build buildings which are strong and can protect people's lives, and so on and so on and so forth? So we all have exactly the same purpose, but not always to manifest that purpose in exactly the same way. So I'll just add that little caveat in case people say, well, what about human beings that don't get to live to even have free will and so on? Well, who says that every single creation has an identical life path in serving God? No, that's not the case. But our explanation of purpose of life makes much more sense with what we can see from reality.
Yeah, and I think you really summarized it well by saying the essential problem is not the problem of evil, but their problem with an assumption they've made about the purpose of life. Now, you've answered obviously that that's why there is evil in this world, but then there is that question. Well, some atheists put, like Max here, which I've taken from the comments. He's I don't know if he's an atheist or not, but anyway, Max may be a Christian, but he's asking this question: why would we want to worship a God who puts his creation on a test to suffer unspeakable evils?
Okay, so again, the question really is making an assumption as well, which is, firstly, what do you mean by evil? And what makes God worthy of worship? There's two things to there. So he argues it seems to be there's an assumption of, I call it the cosmic wish genie kind of hypothesis, right? Where, and this is from I suppose the liberal kind of perspective on things, where they think, well, if God exists and our purpose of life is to have pleasure, then he must exist as a cosmic wish genie to grant our wishes and to do good things for us. In essence, he serves us, we don't serve him. And that is very entitled, I could say, but and arrogant in a way that we're the center of the universe, we're the center of creation. What we would actually say is that God isn't evil when he subjects us to tests which we find hard, which we find challenging, which we find very painful and we suffer through. We say that God is just and he's merciful. And so he's just in that he will never treat people unjustly, but his justice and mercy are not limited only in this life, and there isn't only this life. There's also a hereafter, which is by far vastly disproportionate in its magnitude compared to this. It's eternal, right? So if God subjects you to a little bit of suffering in this life, but then a lot of reward and pleasure in the next, never ending, in fact, then you could only ever say that basically God was supremely merciful, in fact, because your suffering is extremely brief compared to eternity. for what for the trials you suffer. But the thing is this, is that the suffering is required to give us free will and to give us the opportunity to manifest that free will, to show our true colors in this life. Because what's the point of putting somebody who could have been a mass murdering rapist who enjoys it and was never guilty about it, would never find anything bad about it? Why put them into a paradise forever? Well, that wouldn't be fair. That wouldn't be just. So this kind of life is to filter out the wheat from the chaff, as they say. Is to filter out, to find your true colors in this life, and then appoint you and give you a recompense next life. This life is a test, basically. Yeah.
So you've definitely answered the question from the perspective of the coherency aspect. But the reply you usually get, which is funnily enough going to be my next question, and then Max literally just posted that, is fair enough, you can give that coherent answer, but usually the response you get from people is one of emotivism. They're like, like Max has written here, a little bit of suffering, wow, fair. It doesn't matter if it's logically consistent for you to do that, or if it's coherent. It's just like, it's that emotional aspect. So how would you address that? Because that's a lot more difficult, I think, to address than the logical aspect.
Well, you see, there was once I saw a video with I think the head of the British Humanists Association, British Humanist Association, and now it's just called, I think, British Humanists, I think. His name's Andrew Cobson. So he's an atheist, very well-known advocate for atheism in UK and secularism. So he was once asked in a conference by a fellow atheist, in a million years' time, would any of our lives have any meaning? Right? What would be the point of anything we do, or our lives at all, of anything we strive for in a million years' time, when it's like you didn't even exist? And Andrew Cobson, I feel, struggled to answer that question. At first, he didn't know how to answer it, but then he struggled to answer that question. He said, well, look, I just prefer to think about it as I'll give myself my own life meaning. I don't think about a million years' time. Right. Now, here's the thing. So when people say, and I say a little bit of suffering, even the worst possible suffering you could ever imagine for the longest duration that the human lifespan could allow, would be completely inconsequential compared to an eternity of reward and pleasure and the mercy of God. So in that sense, yes, it is a little bit, and in fact, it will be dwarfed. And it reminds me of a hadith. To paraphrase this hadith, there'll be people who will go to paradise, or have a taste of paradise in hereafter, and they'll be asked, did you ever suffer? And they said, no, I've never suffered. I've never suffered before. Even though they have suffered in their life, but compared to even just getting a little taste, forget even experiencing an eternity, just getting a little taste of the hereafter, of paradise, they thought, you know what, I never suffered. And there'll be those who basically will be going to Jahannam, or let's say called hell in English, and they'll ask, did you ever have any pleasures? And they said, no, we've never had any pleasures. And this could be people that live privileged lifestyles in this life. So by comparison, yes, it is a little bit of suffering, but the suffering is there. It has a utility, right? It's not done gratuitously. If God was kind of initiating suffering upon people gratuitously, just for its own sake, just to inflict suffering, then I'd see the point. But that's not the case, right? The case is that the suffering, as well as the pleasure, let's not forget, are both tools, or both aspects of our existence required to fulfill our function, required to fulfill our purpose. Pain is basically the consciousness of our limitations, the fact that we can't avert ourselves from something we don't like. Whereas if somebody could lived in complete happiness and bliss, they would feel they would themselves to be almost godlike, because nothing could limit them. Nothing that they don't like occurs. You understand? So pain is almost a reminder, in essence, that we are limited creatures, and all finite beings with consciousness experiencing pain. It reminds us, and it certainly makes it clear to us, that we are not the gods of reality, right? There is a God of reality beyond us, and he's the one who chooses infliction of pain and pleasure as tests for us, as examples for us to know what we are in relation to existence and our place in existence.
Yeah. And I think when you mentioned, like, let's not forget pleasure here. Yeah, I think we can sometimes forget that point, because it's a very interesting point. Why is no one saying, well, why does God allow pleasure?
Yeah.
We don't actually do that. Now, Honor, he's written a comment. I just wanted to read it out because I thought it was quite ironic. He said, the same secularists that tell us religious people do not use emotion when making intellectual decisions constantly use emotion when it comes to God. So referring to, obviously, and this has been the case, that you can address the problem even in a logical way, but then in an emotional way, atheists usually try and answer that with some sort of little, comment like, whoa, who's God to do this or whatever. And so Honor asks another question, and this is related to, again, the topic of today, which is, do we really need God? So for you, to Abdullah, do you think the West will ever accept religion again? And also, if atheism and nihilism, we'll deal with that in another episode. So do you think religion will make a comeback in the West?
Okay. Well, in this sense, first of all, I just want to answer a point that was mentioned just a bit before that, which is to kind of follow on from that, what the brother said. I'm assuming brother or sister, who's Honor. The problem with atheists is they can't stop but anthropomorphizing God. So they subject God to the same standards that they would subject all human beings to. So, but God is a different category. And just to give you an example, so let's say everyone would generally agree that arrogance is a bad trait.
Yep.
Arrogance is a bad trait, but no one ever asks, or one, but let's say most people don't ask, why is it a bad trait? Why is it a bad trait for humans to be arrogant, right? To have a sense of pride in yourself, to think that you are basically the best, and so on and so forth. Well, they'd say, well, the reason is because it's actually untrue, right? If you're a genius, let's say, you shouldn't be arrogant about it because you didn't give yourself that geniusness, right? You were born with it. Maybe it's genetic. Maybe you had a great education, a whole number of things. You didn't give that to yourself. If you're wealthy, well, you know what? You got that wealth either from inheritance, like Donald Trump, or and then he just used it, and then someone who got lucky. Many people try businesses, really great ideas, and they fail. Other people, they are a bit more fortunate or blessed, as we would say. So they didn't really determine with 100% certainty their own success, nor can they control the world to 100% degree to guarantee the outcomes. So they can't really take pride. The same way like you'd say, for example, these white supremacists who are have pride in their, let's say, skin color or their race, quote unquote. It's ridiculous because they didn't choose their ethnicity they were born into. So if they didn't choose it, how can they have pride in something they didn't choose? It's not like it's an achievement you did when you strive for it, you work for it, right? Yep. So arrogance is wrong because you're not omnipotent. But God, God can't be arrogant, but God, in the way we'd understand it, but God can be, in essence, glorify himself because he is worthy of that, because he's omnipotent, he's infinite potentiality, as in he can do whatever he wills. Nothing can restrain his will. He can create anything he wishes and do as he wants. And he will 100% of the time guarantee exactly the consequence that he wants to see happen. And so therefore, in a way, he can't be arrogant. Although if someone was to say the same thing about themselves as God says about himself, that would be arrogance. No. Understand? Because it's not, the reason why it's wrong for humans is because it's not true, it's not correct, and so on and so forth. So likewise, subjecting God to human morality is also equally ridiculous. The only thing that obviously we can expect from God is what God tells of himself, is that he will not be unjust and that he is also merciful. But without going into advanced theology, one could argue that his mercy and his justice is also the same thing, because he forgives those who deserve to be forgiven, who repent for their sins. And as one hadith mentions, a person who repents sincerely is like a person who has never committed sin. It's like they have no sin. So in essence, then it would be, God forgives them is also the same as being just, in a way. It's his justice, because they have learned from their mistake, and they're a different person in essence, right? Yeah. And that's basically, subhanAllah, what we can expect from God. So the problem with atheists is they have issues with God because they think that God is some kind of is an equal to them and some interloper in their lives. So if God does exist, he's interfering in their lives without right, according to their perspective. When what they don't realize, what's really happening, and you could say the ontological answer to do humans need God, is that God is sustaining their very existence. Their very each the Planck time unit is being sustained by God constantly, right? And that's why in Islam, really, kufr, or the rejection of the truth, rejection of God, is really a form of ingratitude. And there is a type of kufr called the kufr of ingratitude, and that's really what they are arguing when they try to subject God to human standards because they view him as an equal to themselves, which is ridiculous.
Yeah. No, absolutely, and that kind of reminds me of the Quranic verse that the pagans, the Meccan pagans, they wanted to assign to Allah daughters, right? Something that Allah says that they don't want for themselves. Now, that's not to say that Allah is putting down the idea of having daughters, but simply that they're being inconsistent by something they don't like for themselves and applying it to Allah. But also, humanity is inconsistent from another perspective, that, say, Abdullah, right, something which is true, right? So a lot of you guys probably don't know this, but me and Abdullah go back like 10 years, like 2010, right? So in the beginning days, I learned a lot from Abdullah in Speaker's Corner and whatnot. So if I was to give him extra privilege from the perspective that he has something which I don't, and if there's other younger du'at with me, no one would say that's a negative thing because somebody has a trait which you respect. In the same way, somebody's given you a favor, right? Say your house is destroyed because of some storm, and somebody comes along and he's, buying loads of houses for people, and he buys this whole area and lets people live there. And say they're walking somewhere and they let him walk in front, right? This is a normal human thing that you benefit from somebody. And you give them an extra respect. Now, we cannot compare this to Allah, right? But just thinking about it, if Allah is the creator, if Allah is completely in control of everything and everything we have is because of him, then to deny Allah that privilege is being completely inconsistent.
Well, yeah, it's ingratitude basically, for the very fact that he's given us all the things, all the things that we enjoy, and also our very existence, our consciousness, our capacity to even have free will in the first place. Everything he's given us, everything, and as one verse of the Quran says, that we will never be able to count the blessings that Allah has given us. We'll never be able to count what He has done for us, even fathom it, basically. So now, to jump back to the question that I was asked, do I think that the West would ever embrace religion again? I believe they will. And now this is just I would say is my theory, and I don't. It's not obligatory for anyone to adopt it. It's just my personal opinion, and I make a distinction from that. And obviously, where I'm talking about Islam, so this is just my personal opinion. And on that matter, I think that if you look at the history of the West, and I think if you look at the history of a lot of civilizations, you have oscillations in their society, so they'll become more worldly or secular, and then they become more religious or conservative. So the Victorians were very conservative in the UK, a very conservative time, but then prior to the Victorians, it was actually very licentious, right? And you have the rise of libertinism and so on and so forth, those kind of famous Renaissance 18th century French court scenes where everyone's having crazy parties and things like that, and then it just became more conservative, and then it became a bit more peace and free love and that kind of thing in the 60s and 70s. And strange enough, with millennials today, they're actually a bit more conservative than their ancestors were.
Yes,
maybe you could say it's due to sexually transmitted infections, STIs, and all such matters. But actually, even despite whatever protections are available, they're actually they are less licentious today than they were in the past, to an extent. So that's kind of very interesting. And of course, what you're seeing is that the rise of religion being brought back as a part of national culture, and it's repackaged in the form of as national culture, national heritage. The rise of right-wing adoption of and advocacy of religion, is consistent with European history and its oscillations of between religiousness and kind of a more secular, or should we say, worldly social culture. So, and that was basically the issue. I mean, and we could even go back to, was it the time after Charles II, I believe, when during the English Civil War, England went back from there was obviously a very Puritan government by the Oliver Cromwell, for 6 months, extremely religious and very stern, very austere. And then it went back to a kind of more party-going, licentious kind of culture. So this oscillations happen throughout history in many Western countries, and I believe it's just a human trait that we always will see. But I think that secularism and liberalism itself, secular liberalism, will be it's starting to decline, and we're seeing the rise of kind of right-wing ideologies which will bring religion. Whether that's a good thing for many people is a different question. I don't think it's, and when I talk about right-wing ideology, I don't mean those who are saying let's go back to the Bible. I'm saying those who say let's it's the nation first, and part of our national identity is X religion, and they use religion as just an identity, not as a source of morality. So there's a distinction between like the Hindutva of India. They're not looking into the Vedas to guide Indian society. They're just saying we're Hindu, and Hinduism should be the national identity of India as the traditional religion of this land, even though it's not one religion, and it's not even a religion. It's just you define it in the modern Western sense. So I do see that people will be going back to religion in the West, whether that's a good thing or not, whether it was ever a good thing, either religion or materialism in the West is a different discussion, of course. But I do believe, my personal theory is that they're going back to religion in a different, not in the exact same form they did in the past, but certainly going back to it.
Yeah, and that is, I think, not only is it historically true, it's also a bit something you can predict even without history, which is that human beings will always, I mean, there's only certain limits you can cross before you start going back. And it kind of reminds me of artificial selection. So if you start breeding, ants, they're not going to get to the size of elephants, right? And you get this with other creatures as well, that when you start breeding animals, then there's a certain limit that they reach that they go back to their sort of stock size, yeah? So you have this oscillating thing in it. Also, I'm sure you're aware of, the whole rise of Christian evangelism in the United States in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And the generation of students in those times became a lot more religious, right? People like Billy Graham, Campus Crusade for Christ. You had this entire movement in the campus that you never really had prior to that, when people were more socialist and they were more likely to be atheists and whatnot. Now, I want your thoughts on something. You've obviously, I think you have debated Douglas Murray in the past?
Briefly, yes.
Yeah, when was this? Was this when you were part of a group?
It was BBC Big Questions, and it was very brief. I wouldn't say it was an exactly fair platform, because they didn't allow me to respond to him. But I made a point to him, because he's a neoconservative, and for purposes which are useful for neoconservatism, they like to associate like the motivations for terrorism with religious doctrines. Right? Yep. Just not political circumstances or motivations. No, with specifically doctrines in books. So basically, a guy wakes up one day, opens the Quran, and then is now motivated by a particular interpretation of that Quran to commit acts of terrorism. That's their narrative they like to yep. posit. And many Muslims have actually fallen into that assumption too, which is incorrect. So I simply made a point in that program to him and challenged him on this matter, which I said, okay, considering there's Muslims living in South America, there's Muslims in Switzerland, Muslims in the Republic of Ireland. How many terror attacks have occurred against these countries by the Muslim populations living there? If the motivation for these attacks, according to your narrative, or the narrative of neoconservatives generally, is that these Muslims are committing terror attacks because they hate Western lifestyle. right? So the freedom, the irreligiosity, the licentiousness, blah, blah, blah. Okay, that's the motivation. And I'm assuming that obviously South America is very much a very liberal society, comparatively speaking. And also the Republic of Ireland and Switzerland, of course, are liberal Western countries, no less. You're in Europe. How many terror attacks have occurred there when there's sizable Muslim populations there, and including in, I think it is, I think it's, if I remember correctly, Guyana, I think in South America, has 14% of the population is Muslim. That's more proportionally speaking than there are Muslims in France, proportionate to the rest of the population. So how comes you don't see terrorism happening there when these are Western countries or Westernized countries or liberal countries? And he couldn't answer that. And I said, well, isn't it, what do they all have in common? It's because they have neutral, non-interventionist foreign policies, right? They don't send their militaries around the world bombing people. And surely it is not this shows then that it is disgruntlement on Western foreign policy of particular militant countries that are causing people to be motivated to commit terrorism, and not religious texts that are motivated or interpretations of religious texts, right?
Yeah.
So when I put that out, he had no response to that, because the reason why I felt that had to be challenged, because he was using neoconservatives use that to demonize Islam, and atheists in a more general sense just use that as one example to demonize religion. Say, oh, look what religion does, it causes wars. And I say, well, actually, secular nationalism has caused far more wars. I would say, almost rhetorically speaking, 99.5% of the war in the last 100 years have been based primarily on secular nationalism.
Yep. And my daughter's crying and she happened to just walk into the room. Okay, just 1 second, sorry. My wife's coming to. Okay, let her stay. She wants to come. Come in. Okay, sorry about that.
Contribute. She'll probably do a better job than me.
Just 1 second. 1 second. Sorry about that. Come here. Come here. As they say, here's one I made earlier. So basically, I wanted to ask you about Douglas. Douglas Murray, with his view about, in The Strange Death of Europe, he wrote about the importance of religion and the importance of religion for Western civilization. So, what's your thoughts on that?
Sorry, say that again.
Douglas Murray and his view, there's a role for faith, right? And faith is a good thing, right? In terms of keeping society together. The whole Nietzschean problem of meaning and life not having a purpose. And the future of Europe, according to him, will be judged by how we treat our churches. So even though he attacks Islam and religion, at the same time, he sees value in religion. And that's related, of course, to the return of religion in the West. I mean, what are your thoughts on this?
Okay. So, I just remember. So it's not Guyana, it's Suriname. Sorry, Suriname in South America. The one that has 14% of the population is Muslim. Last time I checked. Sorry, just to correct my typo. Okay, so the thing is this. When we say religion, so we mean is a way of life based on a worldview, based on something that's greater than human beings. Now, in that perspective, we need to have something. Society needs to have something. As I think Brother Hamza also used to say, a conceptual anchor. But what I would, which I think is a good way of describing it. It has to have something that solidifies something that's absolute to be the basis for meaning, to be the basis of a criteria for judgment. So I'll give you two examples, two results of detaching God from kind of life's affairs in the West. So one of them is obviously Nietzsche posited that morality, or morality has no longer any foundational basis beyond the human being, and so that morality should be based on people or an elite few of people who have the power and strength to be the Ubermensch, to strong individuals who can pioneer their own morality, make good and bad according to how they wish. right? And obviously that makes everything subjective, because then it becomes, well, morality, good and bad, depends on the individual who desires something to be good and bad, which is obviously it's ridiculous. So that's morality. The second problem is also language, which most people don't realize. The whole point of post-structuralism in the West, or sometimes you could refer to as postmodernism, I suppose, is that language itself is also not absolute, because they argue that, well, why should we follow a dictionary definition of words when that's just socially constructed by a society, which they would then argue usually by a superior or strong minority who are in power, or a particular cabal or group, or whoever, or a different culture or a different ethnic group, or whatever argument they bring. They'll say that why language itself is also arbitrary and reflects power relations and control, and we need to free ourselves, and we can to do so you can use language in any way you want. So now language no longer becomes based on consensual agreement or within a society, because they argue there is no consensus. There's just the ruled and the ruler. So now the meaning in language now is broken down, and they use that to say that also that knowledge or epistemology is also then subjective, because language is also part of that. Encoding meaning is subjective. So anything you read is also going to be subjective, and therefore meaning itself and how you interpret the universe is subjective. Now, they don't believe that there is no, let's say, objective reality. Usually, the continental philosophy has embraced the perspective that human beings cannot objectively know objective reality, right? So, and therefore, they'd argue that multiple interpretations are possible, and no one is more authoritative than the other in interpretation, more or less. Although there are many postmodern thinkers or post-structuralist thinkers would argue that, well, maybe there are certain, let's say, science experiments we might defer to in practically speaking, that these opinions derive from science experiments, and someone we might obviously view to have some authority or more authority than a layman's idea. However, generally speaking, interpretation of the universe is subject to multiple interpretations, and each one is at least a viable or a valid interpretation, whatever you think might be more stronger, more authoritative one differs. But they all agree that generally speaking, multiple interpretations are possible and are viable and should be encouraged. So you have this not only rebellion against an absolute morality, but a rebellion against even absolute meaning in language. When from an Islamic perspective and basis, we'd say that for language, we'd say that the first language, hey, salam. So waving, no waving back. Waving on behalf. Okay. So what? So I've lost my train of thought there. So when it comes to it's in the Quran, it says that language was actually introduced to mankind from God, and sociologists still have not been able to explain the origin of language. Interesting enough, just a little segue there, Thomas Hobbes wrote in his book Leviathan that God taught Adam alayhi salam the first words, meanings of things. But interestingly, this doesn't occur in the Bible. I was thinking, where in the Bible is this? But it's not in the Bible. So where did Thomas Hobbes get that from? Interesting question, maybe, we don't know, right? But it's in the Quran. And it's also in Ibn Khaldun's treat, kind of Muqaddimah, which I think, practically speaking, Thomas Hobbes might have just read a bit and been influenced by, or either that or indirectly. So we need to have God for language, really, to have some kind of, at least to argue that the first language taught to mankind was one that was based on objective truth.
Yeah.
Right? And afterwards, all other languages are just evolutions of that first language that was taught to mankind. So there's something there. The language means something, and it has representation. It's not arbitrary, like post-structuralists would argue. That's language. The second thing is morality. Now, you might think, well, what is morality? And I think no one really asks that question when they say, what is morality? I think I'm going to be a bit radical here, which is, I would say that in a way, morality actually doesn't exist. It's really, all we could say is that it is actually the commands of God That the only thing of any meaning. Why do I say this? Because good and bad, what is the definition of good and bad? Right? How do you define good and bad? You can't. It can only be defined relative to a purpose. For example, I always use the example of a car. You know, if you have a car that works, has an engine, and it drives you from A to B, it's a good car. If a car doesn't have wheels, no engine, no steering wheel, it's a bad car. And why is it bad? Because it doesn't fulfill its purpose. So good and bad can only be defined in relation to purpose. And so therefore, if we don't have a purpose, then there is no basis for good and bad at all. Whereas if God's existence and God creating us with intention behind our existence gives us this purpose, and purpose is nothing but meaning intention. There's an intentionality behind our existence. And therefore, if we are in accordance with the intention behind our existence, with our purpose, then we are good. And if we're not in accordance with that, we are acting badly.
Yep.
And that's the only way you can ever measure good and bad. A second point, and to add to this, and something I wanted to mention for a long time, which was, and it's related also, it reminded me to mention this because of your recent debate with the Cosmic Skeptic, which I saw, which was a very fascinating debate. So, mashallah, thank you for your efforts in that. May Allah reward you. On that debate, the idea of meaning was quite interesting, and it takes me back to Andrew Copson when he was asked that question. In a million years, would your life have meant anything? Would it have been completely inconsequential whether you existed or not? And that's quite interesting because, for example, if I said to you, could you go build a house for me? And after you build it, I'm going to knock it down. Your first response would be, well, why do you want me to build that? What purpose, what point is having a house? Let's say I asked you to build so it could be resided in, and then I knocked it down 5 minutes after you built it. There'd be no purpose. Get away from me. Just give me a little wave. Just a little wave.
Sorry about this. your last words were there'd be no purpose.
Sorry?
Your last words were there would be no purpose.
There would be no purpose, yeah. So there would be no purpose or point to building the house because by destroying it, I've made your activity completely inconsequential.
Yeah.
Right? So if from the Islamic perspective, we actually can say that actions have meaning because they resound throughout time, forever, in fact. In the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the creator of the universe, our actions will have eternal consequences, right? So there is a point in doing some good because that good that you want to do, let's say helping your neighbor, helping your family, or like helping someone in need, or praying, or all these things have a consequence which will be consequential a million time units in the future, whatever, in the hereafter, and so on, or a billion or a trillion. They always will have this consequence. It will forever affect you and therefore be worth it, therefore have a meaning that is always going to be consequential. And so therefore, really, we could say that we are the only ones who can live lives with meaning, those who recognize our purpose and live according to it. That's the only basis for our actions ever to be deemed to be consequential.
And I think that's a really profound point, which I haven't really thought about the connection between that sort of life without a purpose, that nihilistic understanding, and morality. I'll give you an example of something that just came to mind when you were speaking. When I was looking at the history of World War I, there was a video that was explaining that usually when wars take place, the intellectuals are actually anti-war. They're actually against war, and they're speaking out and saying, we don't want this and whatnot. World War I was different in that the intellectuals were sort of pushing on the war. They weren't the catalyst, but they were supporting it. And one of the things that was actually explained about why the intelligentsia, if you want to call it that, were so pro-war was the fact that European philosophy and European academics had become more nihilistic because of the turn away from religion, and that led them to actually support the First World War, because it was kind of like almost a restlessness which was broken through war. And when I first heard this, it almost sounded comical, but this is what some historians have actually said about why they supported the war.
Well, I mean, the connection between, let's say, materialism and war, or let's say a purely material perspective to life or material motivations, have always been connected to warfare, much more than traditional religion has. In fact, there hasn't really been many. You could count all the religious wars that occurred in human history. I'd arguably speak, at least significant ones anyway, on two hands, if that even. I could even say one hand, maybe. So 30 years war, okay, crusades, okay, but in terms of wars which were done due to intolerance, right, due to hatred or the view that you must exterminate the other, those kind of wars, you could count religious motivations for those wars on possibly on one to two hands. Whereas nationalist motivations or motivations due to tribalism, due to self-interest, benefit, and so on and so forth, well, you'll need all the world's peoples of hands to count that, right? Because that's been the main justification. In fact, what you've seen is religion, or should we say belief in a God, has always been a mitigation against warfare. And let's take the Catholic Church. So yes, the Catholic Church initiated the Crusades against the Muslim world, true. But for the most part within Europe, they were mostly concerned with telling Catholic monarchs to stop fighting each other. Even under threat of excommunication, they say, we will takfir you, we'll kick you out of the church if you keep on fighting your fellow Catholic monarchs, because we should all be one united Christendom, right? And that was their argument. And so the Catholic Church probably stops a lot of wars. It didn't always work. It usually didn't. Well, when I say usually, it didn't stop wars. Maybe there would have been much more wars without the Catholic Church trying to prevent Catholic monarchs from fighting each other. But it just shows what they were doing was actually not trying to instigate wars, but trying to prevent wars or limit wars. I mean, yes, the 30 Years' War was an example. We had a split between the Protestants, the three factions of Protestants and Catholics. But that was, again, an exception in history compared to the rule. In Islam as well, the prohibition of killing with unjust cause, certainly killing believers, has been, I would argue, a mitigation against people fighting, Muslims fighting each other. Unfortunately, when Muslims go off book, as they say, off holy book, and they don't refer to the Quran and Sunnah, that's when they start fighting each other for purely material considerations, for power, for boundaries, and so on and so forth. And every time you've seen wars in history, it's usually been motivated for that. Even the argument about, the splits in the madhabs in Islam rarely actually instigated wars. Usually it was actually just fighting between rival sultans or wula in different areas of the Muslim world fighting each other, despite the fact that the caliph, even when the caliphs didn't have power or didn't have direct power, should we say, were urging Muslims to be unified and to not fight each other. But the Muslims were still doing it despite religion, not because of religion, right? So they're doing it in spite of religion, not because of Islam. And that's really what religion has. Its function in many societies is basically to create order and peace. It's always been its main function. Even, and I'll say this also, even when it comes to Islam's the kind of expansionist, let's say, history, where Muslim armies kind of took over new lands, it wasn't out of a motivation for intolerance and extermination, because historically speaking, all these new peoples that were absorbed into Islam were not exterminated. No genocides were done when new lands were absorbed. What you actually saw was, and I like to define it as this, because this is what it seemed to be aiming at historically and from the text, it's the Pax Islamica, to use a Latin term. It is in essence the demilitarization of the world. That instead of having different nations and tribes with their own militaries fighting each other, you just have the peace and security of the world guaranteed by Muslims, and everyone else demilitarized. But their law, they can live by their own laws. They can live by their own culture and religion. They can, the local resources still benefit them. It's not like an empire where you extract the resources. And as you know, historically speaking, the capitals of the Muslim lands have actually been much more impoverished than many outlying cities. one example being Medina was the capital of the Islamic, caliphate, and the capital got moved what's it called, Constantinople eventually, but was it Baghdad, then to Constantinople, and before that Damascus. So it's like, the British Empire, if it was, you're saying it's imperial, and yet it moves its capital to Delhi, let's say. Is it still the British Empire when its capital, its most prosperous capital, benefiting from everything is Delhi? I mean, isn't London meant to be its capital? You wouldn't say that. Whereas for Muslim history, it was irrelevant where the capital was, because everyone benefited from their own local resources, and everywhere the Muslims went, experienced prosperity, and there wasn't extraction of resources like you saw, or tax paid to the central capital like you saw happening in the Roman Empire, where they would demand all different territories pay money to Rome, and they take their money and put it centrally. So Islam has actually been a motivation for peace and demilitarization of the world, uniting many different tribes and ethnic groups. And this only stopped when Muslims stopped referring to Islam, and then when they stopped referring to Islam one hadith mentions, to paraphrase this hadith, when Muslims stopped ruling by Islam, they'll divide into groups and fight each other. Muslims start dividing into groups and fight each other, and that's what's happening. They fight each other over ethnicity, over nationalistic motivations, not religious motivations. So anyway, I mean, that's kind of religion has always been a cause for peace in the world, and materialism has always been a cause for war and exploitation of other people in the world. And so what we need is more religion, not less.
Yeah. And I think this is a very nuanced point, which goes over the heads of atheists, but we have to keep reminding them of this, is that, like you said, violence is part and parcel of human nature. So when you have any group of organized human beings, whether they're secularist or religious, or they're just a cult, they're going to be violent eventually with another group, because human beings, when we gather in large groups, we usually fight. So it's not that religion is going to make the world into, having rainbows and unicorns and everyone's happy. You're going to have violence, but a lot less than if everybody was in a Hobbesian all-out war without actually any sort of thing to bind them. Now, before we go to Essen's question, which is quite good, which is something I really wanted to touch upon, I wanted to go to a micro example, which is the London riots, right? London riots, I saw them as, I don't mean to be crude here, but I saw them as chav nihilism, right? So it's a way of the working class or the simple person expressing the idea of life being meaningless, right? So there were people, because I spoke to people after the riots, and there were people basically saying that normal people who act in a very normal way, when societies, when those things that put you in charge, the carrot and stick of society, if you like, right? When it seems like that was crumbling, they just went berserk. If you had religion would actually have this, cosmic authority that it doesn't matter if the police is not there. You would still have this idea, I need to, be a good person. So this whole idea that we don't need religion to be good is essentially saying we don't need a cosmic, it's essentially saying if we take away the carrot and stick of society, people will still be good. But that's not true, because as we saw with the riots, religion is needed.
Well, I mean, I would say that when you say religion, I would say, just to remind everyone again, I mean a way of life or worldview based on something which is greater than human beings, and I would define that as religion. But the better word would be deen. And as I said, in the ancient world, ancient Greeks or Romans or ancient Chinese or others, they wouldn't even see a distinction between the term. They didn't, right? Their laws, their morality was all the same thing. Ironically, the word ethikos or ethics, that we use this term, it comes from the Greek meaning, just means custom. So what is customary? Their ethics was just what they were living as a custom, or as their religion, or as their way of life, or their culture. And that's interesting. So anyway, I'll say that religion supplies two things: intellectual justification, so good and bad defined according to what is something which is greater than human beings, and two, it provides a intellectual consistency for motivation. which is that it means that we're always consistently motivated to do good regardless of circumstances, exceptions notwithstanding, of course. So I give an example. So in Islam, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said that, to paraphrase, those who torture people in this world will be tortured by God in the next world, in essence, to paraphrase it. So that if you use torture here, you'll use, Allah will torture you. Now, this hadith was narrated by a Sahabi, a companion of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, when he saw that some people were being tortured because they weren't paying their taxes. And he kind of reprimanded them, saying, you shouldn't use torture, right? It's not the Islamic way of life to use torture. Now, here's the thing. So, obviously, Sam Harris, famous or infamous atheist, he argued the ticking time bomb scenario. That he argued that torture can be used sometimes, possibly, there's a moral case for it. When, let's say, if you're going to torture a person who might know the whereabouts of a bomb, and this bomb might kill 1,000 people or 100 or 1,000 people. And if you can save lives by using torture, why not use torture? Why would you be against it? And he said that you might, and he argued in defense, you might be squeamish of this, but if I said 10,000 lives could be saved, 100,000 lives could be saved, 1 million lives could be saved, most people would start to quiver and go, you know what, maybe it might be justified, right? And that's the point, right? Is that when it's convenient, right, they can be moral. When it's no longer convenient, then morality just disappears. And likewise, I'd say that when it comes to, it was a leaked CIA torture report many years ago, which talked about, the torture that CIA was doing. And the argument in America, the strongest arguments from both sides, one was saying that it can save lives. Others said, how do you know it works? That was their only concern. That was, from the strongest voices was just saying, no one said, this goes against your fundamental rights as guaranteed by nature or God, right? No, that's not an argument to it that anyone would use in a secular environment and be taken seriously, because they don't believe that natural rights exist after Jeremy Bentham and Hume. And of course, certainly God-given rights, well, you have to believe in religion, and that's not a secular argument to make, to bring in God to justify your rights. So they had to argue it as, well, how do you know it works? So then I put, well, if you could show it worked, would that justify torture then? Right? And that's where materialists just can't deal with that. They just can't deal with that situation. They have no argument against it. I also see that the Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the nuclear bombs on this. I was once giving a lecture on this, and some non-Muslim atheist guy said, "Well, look, it was needed because it shortened the war." And I said, "Excuse me, are you saying that it was okay to drop nuclear bombs on women and children and non-combatant men? Let's not forget men. It's also wrong to kill non-combatant men too, right? Because it would save the lives of American soldiers. It would just, shorten the war a bit more and save a bit more lives. You're saying that you can kill people, innocent people, if it would shorten the war? The same argument used by Winston Churchill to justify what they called strategic bombing of German cities, and this was before they had targeted bombs, right? Smart bombs, right? So these cities weren't industrialized. These areas they weren't targeting industrialized areas. They're targeting just general cities, and the argument was that it would weaken German morale and shorten the war. You understand? Now this is so targeting civilians to weaken morale so that they change their political determination of that state is the definition of terrorism. That is literally the definition of terrorism, with no hyperbole, right? I'm not using hyperbole here, right? And yet, when it's convenient for materialists to do that, they find it hard to argue against that, right? Even John Rawls, famous the Sheikh Shuyukh of liberalism in the last century, argued that political liberalism allows the supreme emergency exemption to targeting civilians. It's actually called the supreme emergency exemption. Please, everyone, Google it for yourself. Yeah, don't take my word for it. Please Google it. I want you to see his argument. And he argued that liberalism is different. Political liberalism is different from Catholicism. He says, because Catholicism doesn't allow the targeting of civilians under any circumstances, whereas political liberalism, in certain circumstances, when you're fighting an existential war of survival, you can do it.
Yeah.
Right. And that is, I find grotesque. I find it completely grotesque, but not surprising from materialist ethics, as materialist, ethical philosophers are very candid about admitting and advocating even.
Yeah. And that sort of reminds me of something. Well, if I knew this before the debate, I actually would have used it, because I didn't know, what's it called, the supreme
emergency exemption.
Emergency exemption. It just sounds like a better way of saying collateral damage, but it's also, when you were describing Hiroshima and Nagasaki and what the atheists said, it kind of reminded me of the silliness that you get into when you have this idea of, okay, we're going to get rid of, it's just about a particular objective, maximizing pleasure or saving lives or whatever it is, because you get to conclusions which are going to be absurd. So if you start making a chart of the threshold, the total sum of pain that the Japanese went through, and you tally it against if the war went on for another 10 years, and you say, okay, here we have saved by 10%, so therefore we can drop the bomb. Or like I put it to Cosmic Skeptic, that a panda, super sensitive panda, is worth 2 human beings, because they don't see the absurdity. But it's literally the case that any moral principle is literally arbitrary, because you just change the way you achieve the goal, and you have to throw out the morality. Morality is not stable anymore. So religion absolutely gives that basis, and I'm surprised that it's such an obvious point, but atheists don't like to admit it.
Oh yeah, I mean, even when you mentioned about World War I and intellectuals supporting interventionalism, liberal interventionism, might I argue, was what it's kind of referred to now. John Stuart Mill made an argument. He's a liberal, but making a utilitarian, of course, very notably. And he made the argument for intervention in other countries, which he'd viewed as uncivilized, or he'd call barbaric nations, by Christian Europe. He said that it was inevitable to intervene in them, to invade them and control them. And he argued that it would be required in some circumstances to give them, because he views them as immature nations who are still children in human civilization, amongst the human civilizations, to be kind of, they need to be matured into adults, right? So sometimes there can be intervention, sometimes you can establish for them a dictator that would whip them into shape, almost literally. And he used references to this. He used references to, he praised the Mughal ruler Akbar for doing so, for being a stern leader and required for the people in this valley continent, as the Asian subcontinent. This is how he argued. This is exactly what he said. Argued also in France and Algeria, and again you also see many individuals argue for intervention in Algeria and rough treatment of the inhabitants of Algeria because they are quote unquote barbarians. Many people argued this, right? So like de Tocqueville did, specifically, he argued about kidnapping men in Algeria, subject them to raids because it's the only thing they can understand is violence against their violence against the French occupation should be met with violence. They didn't argue whether it was valid to occupy Algeria in the first place. They just justified it because these were inferior nations, right? So they made intellectual arguments from a materialistic basis, saying that they need to be occupied, they need to be changed, their ruling system changed. This was also argued by Lord Cromer for Egypt in British occupation of Egypt, and it was argued for the war, the recent war, the relatively more recent war in Iraq, and also Afghanistan. Yeah, so this is the case, right? This is the case that materialists will justify intervention, and if you were to brought someone from the ancient world and you were to show them this situation, they would just describe it to you as, it seems like these people they don't like all the people who are not following their deen, their way of life, and so they are invading them and forcing their deen upon these people, right? Forcing their religion on these people. right? It just happens to be called liberalism today, or secularism, or what have you, right? And that's what a person from the ancient world would view it as. Like, well, that's what you're doing. You're invading other countries and you're forcing them to change their culture to suit, because it's not your culture, right? Isn't this intolerant? Sounds like intolerant to me, right? And in ancient world, they're much more tolerant. That, you know, even the Roman Empire, or the Empire of Alexander, the quote unquote the Great. They only wanted your tax. They didn't want you to change your culture. They didn't care about your culture. They just wanted your money. Basically, as long as you're paying taxes to Rome or whatever, you're good. Live what you know. Any law system you want, they don't care for the most part. You know. So anyway, that's my point. Was that materialism can't be used to guarantee rights, because rights are immaterial and therefore immaterial ultimately. To the materialist.
Jazakallah khair for, you know, that comprehensive, thorough, I would say, beating down of this whole idea that materialism is better than having a faith in God, and how it's a logical consequence of being a materialist that you'll have to accept these conclusions as being coherent and conclusions as being valid. Now, just before we end, because we're out of time, could you let us know what you're working on, and any future debates or anything coming up, and where people can connect with you?
Okay. I mean, obviously, the current global pandemic has put a lot of stopper on many things. Although, inshallah, I'm going to be looking into doing some online debates now, which would be the new format for everything. I suppose everything's now going to be online, it seems, even after the pandemic, because people in this generation, no one likes to attend events anymore. They like to do it from the comfort of their own home. And now they're on the lockdown, they complain about being stuck in their own home now. Anyway, so just that. But if you want to see more of our work, Muslim Debate Initiative, you can go just to thedebateinitiative.com or muslimdebate.org. Also, my work is abdullahal-andalusi.com. You just type in Abdullah Andalusi, should be the first one or two links to that. And of course, just see the work of the other great speakers in MDI. For those who obviously are not aware, so there's Ijaz Ahmed, there's Sadullah Ali Al-Andalusi, who everyone thinks he's my cousin or brother.
I had it just a week ago.
Yeah, mashallah. I mean, he's my cousin in the sense of we are all cousins from Adam, from Adam alayhi salam, our great grandfather. But he's no more my cousin than our brother Sabor here. But we're all brothers in Islam anyway. So we're not everyone in Al-Andalus, Spain and Portugal are all directly related. Surprise, surprise for everyone who thinks that. Anyway, so so Salah and Lucy, there's brother Sadat Anwar in Canada, Dr. Tabassum Hussain, Sister Zara Faris in the UK, brother Zakir Hussain also in the UK. Great speakers. They do some great debate, great work. Please check them out as well. Yeah.
Definitely. And something else I'd like to just tell everybody watching, and also there's an atheist called HC who joins us every day, and we usually have some good questions with him. He's interested, he's asking a lot of questions. He just came to the feed like now, and that's a bit late, so we can't really get him on. So make sure you go to abdullahandalusi.com, follow the stuff from MDI, and look, we have to be fair here. Not all the debates and all of the arguments and all of these sort of online discussions that you have are equally as good. I would say Abdullah Andalusi, I consider him probably one of the best in the world. So make sure you watch the debates, make sure you watch the discussions. It was the only complaint I have against him is he doesn't come to Speaker's Corner anymore, and he doesn't come with this flag, and he doesn't come with this turban. So we discussed that.
Life, brother, a different ancient history.
So we can have him again, inshallah, on the live feed in probably about 2 weeks' time. I'm trying to get everybody to just, and he can't say to me, I can't come because I know he's at home. He's not going to be anywhere else. And definitely make sure that one of the recent things, what's that debate you had about epistemology in Canada?
Epistemology?
The atheist one you had about 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, something like this.
In Canada? I don't think the video for that is out I'll try and get that published. We have unfortunately, I must apologize for anyone who follows Muslim Debate Initiative. We have a big backlog of videos, and inshallah we'll try eventually, Allah permitting, to get to all of them. But we'll publish a lot of these debates. Every debate we've ever done will be published. The question is obviously when, not if.
And one other thing I'd just like to add is that MDI doesn't do the standard. They do it. I mean, does God exist? But what I like is the uniqueness, right? So one particular debate which really stood out for me is the problem of hell, and that just as its own individual debate. And I think that's definitely something you can learn a lot more than, when one person asks a question in a Q&A about that particular issue. So the reason why I'm rushing is in literally 1 minute time, I'm going to go live on another YouTube channel. So that's why I had to end it. Jazakallah khair. May Allah bless you and your family, and hopefully we will have you again in a couple of weeks' time.
Inshallah, barakallahu feekum, and thanks for having me on, and thank you for everyone attending. Inshallah, we can maybe do this again.
Okay.
Thanks.